Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to a very interesting presentation on the boat building history in Holland, Michigan. And just as an aside, when I was much younger, my uncle owned 3 or 4 Chris Craft inboards, and I can recall how mesmerized I was as a kid hearing that engine getting fired up and so forth. And I still have some great memories of that and skiing on Lake Makatawa. I have the privilege of introducing Geoff Reynolds, who is a professor emeritus of Hope and was connected with the library and served as the former Mary Ross director of the Joint Archives of Hope College with the rank of professor. By the way, try saying that paragraph quickly. It'll keep you going. But he has a new position now with a company he launched called Reynolds Runabouts, not surprisingly on boating and renovating legendary boats. He's currently redoing a 1959 Lake and Sea 18-foot that you can watch on YouTube. And he's going to tell you how you can access this during his presentation. He will be talking about this and boat building in general in the Holland area and how it has evolved over the years. If you have questions, I think Ian just explained to you how you can ask those on the chat button on your screen. So at this point, welcome, Geoff, and we're looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Bob. Glad to be back on Hope's campus, even if it's just virtually today. I recognize a few of the names. I'm sure there's more that I can't, and I hope you say something during the or after the presentation. And if you have something that's pressing, I'm not averse to having you ask that question. With 52 boat companies that I'll be covering, there's bound to be a question that pops up in your head, and I'm fine with you, if Ian and Bob are agreeable to interrupt me and ask that question. So otherwise, I'll look forward to answering them at the end. So today's presentation started when I went to Hope in 1997 as a young archivist for the Joint Archives of Holland. It was one of those projects where when you go to Hope, there's not, around Holland in general, there weren't a lot of historical topics that hadn't been covered, largely due to the abundance of historians in the area. So remarkably, one of the only topics that hadn't been touched very well was the history of the boat building industry in Holland. Randy Vanderwater hadn't touched it, Don Van Rieken. The Van Raalte Institute had just started, so no one had really gotten into that yet, and I don't think they would have. It just wasn't the right subject for them. So I embraced it and started doing a lot of research, not only with people with oral histories, but also talking to the members of the boat building community that were still alive, Leon Slickers, Clyde Paul, Jason Petrulia, and all the women and men that worked in the background or in the factories. And I was able to put together enough to do a book that I published in 2018, and I can talk to you a little bit about that later. But this is how it all kind of started. I started at the beginning, and I was able to generate quite a bit of history, just putting the pieces together, which is fun for not only a historian, but for an archivist. So this is what I found out. So Holland's boat building industry started basically from necessity. We had a lake, and we had people coming into the area even before the Dutch in 1836. There was a small lumber company on the north side where Wakazu Woods is now. And the family there decided that they wanted not only to cut the lumber and sell the lumber, but get it out of the lake. And unfortunately, the boat they built over there, Point Superior, was too big. And they couldn't get out of a very small channel that had been formed there naturally. Thankfully, there was a spring freshet or a flood. It came into Lake Makatawa, and they were able to get the boat out. That boat was built in 1836, and it was called the A.C. Mitchell, and it is the beginning of boat building in the Holland area, if you don't include the Native American or indigenous peoples' building of canoes and dugouts. And even though 1836 photography had not been invented yet, there was a boat in the area called the Scud, which is on your screen, and that was a very close example of what the E.C. Mitchell would have looked like. This photograph is the Scud coming into Holland in the late 18th century off the piers at Makatawa. It kind of gives you a sense of what it was like coming into the piers, riding the waves into a new community known as Holland. The other form of boat that was used in the Holland area were the flatboats. And believe it or not, you used to be able to take a flatboat from Makatawa Park all the way up to the Zeeland area. When the river was a lot deeper, they would push flatboats, both full of settlers, lumber, and other supplies, close to, you would have been up in very close to New Groningen area, and then you would have run out of water. And that, not only did they push or bring up the passengers, New Dutch mostly, some products, flour, things like that, that they couldn't make in Holland. But on the way down the river, they would take shingles that had been made in Zeeland and along the river, and some lumber and other supplies that then could be sold outside of the Holland community. So the flatboat was a very important part of that early shipbuilding as well, because it helped the commerce. And in the beginning, it wasn't about building boats, it was about making money and staying alive, and they did a very good job of that. And unfortunately, like I was talking about the E.C. Mitchell, they couldn't get in and out of the harbor very well. Well, when the Dutch came in 1847, they bought a boat in the Milwaukee area called the Knickerbocker, and which is a very Dutch phrase. And they would come into the community at the Makatawa Piers area, and the schooner would just sit out there in the water, and they would take skiffs and dories to bring people and supplies in and out. And then they would go across a small sandbar, which is where the Makatawa Pier head is. And then they would get on the flatboats and continue their journey. This Knickerbocker was owned by the Holland community just for a few years, but the breaking of package, they call it, it's a very labor intensive and money losing part of trade, and it didn't last very long. And it was sold. The shipyards in Holland were founded largely around the water, as most communities did in the beginning. And then I'll show you how that changes as time goes on. This is the 1875 bird's eye view map of Holland, and you can see several large boats on this drawing, but it's very accurate for the time. The gentleman would walk around the community and they would take scale measurements and drawings of the buildings, and then they would go back to Chicago and put it on a bird's eye view, and they did a very good job. In this photo, you can see a couple steam passenger ships there. The Huron was the first one to come through the Holland piers like that, but also some schooners. Around this basin, you can see was several boat companies, both on the north and south side of town. Later on, the community saw more boat building on the Lake Michigan end of the lake, and I'll talk a little bit more about that too. One of the most famous boats built down where the old West Machine Toolworks was, Western Machine, down by where the boatworks area is now, and there's a park that the city owns, and it's largely just grass. That was the site of the Anderson Shipyard, and that's where the Kate Howard was built. And that facility or that area saw several boat builders using it, not only because it was a good industrial area. A lot of the shipbuilders not only for the schooners, which is the first real building that went on in Holland, but also later on for some of the smaller pleasure craft. 8th Street and 9th Street were heavily populated by boat builders, carpenters, and shipbuilders. So it was a really easy walk to work, if you want to call it. That was the industrial housing part of town at one time. There was a lot of industry there. It would not have been as attractive, maybe, as some of the historic district areas are now. They're farther away from the smoke and the soot and the noise. The only exception would have been the Capon family, and his factory, which is where the Civic Center is now, would have been right down the street. And I think Isaac Capon was able to live with that, a beautiful house so close to an industrial area of town. So after the Kate Howard era, or the schooner era, ended about 1900, the community also saw boat building emerging. I should say evolving into a more refined type of shipbuilding. And even though they were smaller, it was still a very labor intensive, craftsman oriented type of building. This was the dawning of what they call the pleasure boat industry. Before that, we had seen a lot of people using rowboats or sailboats. You go to the White Lake area or the East Coast, pleasure boating in the way of rowing and sailing was huge. It's a very old type of leisure in that area. In the Michigan area, we also had that in a smaller version. So at the site of the Anderson shipyard, another company came in after the Anderson shipyard had closed. It laid vacant for a little while. At the turn of the century saw the invention of the internal combustion engine. It was a little bit different than what we know today. They had steam in its own way, was a form of motive power. But in the Grand Rapids area, the Sense brothers, who were involved in the early engine building of cars that would go to Detroit, they also built marine versions, which drew water in from the lake to cool it versus having radiators. It's called marinized. These gentlemen invented a internal combustion engine, first using what they called naphtha. Naphtha was an early form of primitive gasoline that you could burn, kind of like kerosene. The naphtha engine's design involved not only burning or fueling the heat, but they would circulate naphtha within the motor like steam. So you can see the problem that might cause if there's a connection between flame and fuel. And they did. A lot of naphtha launches burned or blew up because they didn't really understand the connection that you might have with sparks and fumes and things like that. So after the naphtha era kind of ended, we came to know what is, the internal combustion engine now, where gasoline is burned within the motor and it's quite safe. The internal combustion engine era affected Holland also because you didn't have to have a licensed steam engineer on a boat of any size to run a steam engine. Before that, even a boat the size of the Knickerbocker launch here, you had to have a licensed engineer to do that. By going into the industrial combustion engine, it allowed anybody to run a boat and anybody to build a boat. So it really opened up the floodgates for pleasure boating in America, including Holland. And this is just such a great little shot of yet another Knickerbocker on Lake Michigan or Lake Macatawa. And it also showed here's a young man driving the boat that had not been allowed before. At that area also, in that east end of the lake, if you want to call it, if you can visualize going over the Unity Bridge now and looking left up Lake Macatawa, you would have seen a small island, and it was largely just a big chunk of sand, and people from Holland lived on it. One of these inhabitants was G.E. Clark. And not only did he have a house out there with his wife and children, but he also had a boat barn where he built these yachts and launches right there, and then he would sell them worldwide. This advertisement comes from a very large publication for pleasure boat enthusiasts, and they would have been able to order them from Holland from G.E. Clark. When they built the bridge and straightened the channel, that spit or sandbar was removed permanently. So with it went the Clark's original home, and and a few other villagers. They were around from 1907 to 1914, believe it or not. He had a 7-year run on that little sandbar. And here are some pictures of what I would call a big company that finally came to Holland to build boats. And these are the Sense brothers. The Sense brothers not only invented the marine engine for other people, they decided in the Grand Rapids area not only to continue to make marine engines for others, but also to buy into the Holland area where the Anderson shipyard was to build their own pleasure boats. And these images of the two brothers, and then from the very rare brochure I found from 1902 showing one of their large launches being launched right there in Holland at that site. You see how primitive that launching used to be. But that's the two brothers that really got the Holland pleasure boat building going. Now, the second one that came to Holland to build boats, you might recognize the name, the Jessicks. Unfortunately, we lost Lois last year around Christmas, I believe. That was the last of the Jessicks that we, as you know, the modern Jessicks that we knew. It was founded by Lois's father, believe it or not, in the Grand Rapids area. Several brothers got together, including her father Adolf, and they built boats and rented them in the Grand Rapids area in the Canal District. Two of the brothers came to Holland, and two brothers stayed in the Grand Rapids area, not only to work on their version of Jessic Brothers boats, but also to stay involved in the furniture building industry, which they were both heavily involved in. And we'll talk about how that furniture building connection in the Holland area also contributed to the pleasure boating. So two of the brothers came to Holland, and in 1911, they were in the Jennison Park area, which is east of Macatawa. There's a road called Jennison Avenue. That's literally, that's where Jennison started, or the Jennison Park, which was a big amusement park at one time. That's where they would have been, a little bit west of that road. And Lois lived on that road for many years in her retirement. I think it was fun to know that she was still part of that. So they started, in the Holland area in 1910, and in a literal sense, 1911 is when their first boat was the Jennison, believe it or not, was launched. That kind of sparked their first venture in the Holland area. And you can see this very primitive launching going on. Here's a couple of the one brother's in the water to make sure everything goes well in the water, and a few of them are on the launch ramp there. And you can see the building to the right, very primitive, over the water of Lake Macatawa. Unfortunately, 1912, they had a fire. And during the aftermath, a few of the Macatawa Park investors asked the Jessicks to move farther west into what became, Macatawa Park. And there they built this beautiful structure in 1913. Not only did it house the building of the boats, it housed the boats that they built and rented. It housed the area where several boats could be stored. And then it housed the two families. The two families lived in the middle structure until later on they built two identical homes across the street that the two brothers and their families lived in. As the company grew, they needed the space, so they moved across the street. And this lasted, the shipyard area lasted from 1913 to 1973 when the Eldeans bought them out. Here's a couple of a very rare image of the builders of the boats. You believe it or not too many people take pictures of boat builders. And here's a rare photo that Lois Jessic had in a beautiful photo collection she kept of the family's boat building activities. Here are a few of the men that were part of that launching of the Patricia II. The Patricia I was, I think, 47 feet. And then the Patricia II, the gentleman that owned the Patricia I wanted a bigger boat. So he commissioned them to build this beautiful mahogany Jessic cruiser called the Patricia II. I believe the Patricia II is still on the west coast of America. It's been restored and people still use it. But as you can see, some of the beautiful work they did. And largely because of the facilities being larger, they could do bigger boats. Before the war, the last thing that the Jessic family got to build was the International 110 racing boat. It's a racing class, single design, that you can still race today. In fact, here is the one built in 1939 in Holland. And it won, I believe, in 2019, it won the international championships, which were held in Makatawa Park. And this is it. This is from 1939. It's still going strong. Made out of plywood, very easy to make, and the Jessic sold hundreds of these to communities around the U.S. And these are still built in Holland by a different designer and builder. I can talk about him later. Another company in Holland that unfortunately was founded, as you can see from the date, fall of 1929, and it was the North Star Marine Construction Company. I've never found a surviving vessel from this company, but one was built, and it went to the 1930 January New York Boat Show, which was right after the crash of the stock market and really before anybody knew how bad it was. They shipped this boat from Holland to New York, and it was built it was the old lumber company that's on Lincoln Avenue at 16th Street. It's now Warden. They build library furniture. I believe it's Warden Furniture there. That's where this boat was built, in that original lumber company area. They rented them space to do this. The gentleman that founded this company went to Grand Rapids and built little race boats, but nothing more has ever been found out about the company. This is really, if you find this one, you've got yourself the holy grail of Holland built boats. And I keep looking. And from what I can tell, it only lasted 1 year. So it doesn't get any more rare than that. Another gentleman that came to Holland just before the war and had kind of a spotty history with Hollanders and with the U.S. government was Captain Gilbert. And he founded what he called the Gill Boat Company. This was the first boat company in the Holland area not to use wood. They used metal, and they would bend these shapes. They'd take a big metal sheet and bend it into the boat, and then they would weld it together and form an impenetrable and unsinkable boat. The seats, as you can see there in the drawing, those became air chambers, and you couldn't sink the boat. And that was a kind of a cool new concept. This is Mr. Gilbert. Whether he was a true captain, I'm not sure. That was the title he was given, and I've never been really able to figure out whether he did have a captain's license. That the boat the company location was located on River Avenue, which is named because the river used to be, or the lake used to be, right on his doorstep. Since Padnos bought that land from the defunct furniture companies in that area, that became filled in with different things. It was a landfill at one time, and then a lot of the area that Padnos sits on now was filled in from the lake bottom. When they straightened out the lake a little there, a lot of that fill became the Padnos site. So this boat company, if you go down North River Avenue and you're at the railroad tracks, you look left, there's kind of a indescript tannish gray building on your left. That's the old furniture company. That's where the Gill boats were built. And he had this outside venue you can see under the tarp, and you could go visit this, this deck area and look at his boats, right? And then maybe try it out on the lake. Another company that was formed before the war was Campbell Boat Company. That site is the South Shore Marine. If you're on South Shore Drive, heading west, and you'll little turn to the left. South Shore Marine is that big white rooming house type building that's still there. And the Park Township launch is right there as well. That's where the Campbell Boat Company was founded in 1937. It was a former rooming house for resorters, and Kenny Campbell bought it in 1937 to turn into his boat company. And when I went in there in the late 90s or early 2000s, I went to the top floor in the attic, and that's where his drafting or lofting room was. And there were still drawings on the floor of, they would loft the boat in full dimensions and then do the patterns up there and then haul them down the stairs and into the boat shop, which is on the front or the lakeside. And then they could build the boat. So it was, and I was able to find the records of not only Campbell, but Beacon, which is the company that followed them. And those are now housed at the Joint Archives of Holland. This is a photo, typical launching photo. You would have had all the crew on the deck, and the man that owns, the woman that owns the boat is off to the left there in the cockpit. The men all would have had a beer, and the women probably had a wine, and they would put the boat in the water and then finish some of the fine detail rigging once it was done. The Coronado, believe it or not, was one of the best boats on Lake Macataw for many years. It was I believe a Chicago man owned it and had it commissioned, and it was launched in 47 and then eventually ended up in California, where it unfortunately sank off the coast. So it had a large journey to get to the east or the west coast and did very well. This company lasted from 1937 to 1956. And here are one of the boats, pre-war, beautiful sailboat being built. If you're to go down to South Shore Marine and look in the windows, this is exactly what it looks like now without the boats. There's a gentleman in there, a boat builder by the name of Geoff Reinhardt. And Geoff not only uses the space to build and restore boats, but is kind of the caretaker for the man that owns the boat. The building lives just to the west there. Chicago artist owns that site now and wanted to keep it as was when the Dawson family owned it. And Geoff, it's so fun to go in there and still smell mahogany being worked on, just like it was in the 30s and 40s. And the last company to be founded in the Holland area before the war was the biggest one of all, Chris Craft. The Smith family out of Algonac, Michigan. Thus, Christopher Columbus Smith was the founder and the father. His son Owen is the one that said, "Hey, you know, we need a brand name." And Chris Craft, 1922, is kind of the name they settled on, named it after their father. And they were having a lot of trouble in the Algonac area with finding anybody to work. They own the biggest company in town. They employed more employees than anyone else in Algonac. And when there were labor shortages or labor disputes, it put them in a very vulnerable position when it came to leverage. And that's what we're going to call it. They had been unionized, and like much of East Michigan, was a lot of union activity. And Chris Smith's thought was, we need to find an alternative site where we can build boats, but also, you know, kind of avoid some of these issues that keep, you know, popping up every once in a while from labor. And so he ended up founding the Holland plant number 2, so that they could, you know, kind of combat some of that and also keep production going. If the Algonac plant struck, they could also just keep, you know, building in the Holland area, which he knew very well to be full of woodworkers from the furniture companies, but also huge anti-union sentiment. And he knew that he was going to do fine over there. So on the north side of Holland, on technically at the end of, it would be the Howard area. And gosh, I've been out of Holland too long already. As you head west towards the north side of town, they founded this big 40-acre site. And you can still see the water tower. It's so nice to be able to see not only the building, remnants of the building in the inside of that bigger structure, but the water tower sticking up. There was also a rail line that ran past there, which they needed to get supplies in and boats out. That worked out very well. And this became one of the largest employers in Holland for a long time. And they lasted in the Holland area until 1989. So almost a complete 50 years. Unfortunately, Chris Smith did not get to see the building. He died that fall. And they were finished in December, and they put their first boat into the consumer's hands in 1940. And this is the little boat they built. It's not unusual for a new factory like that to start out with some time or tried and tested boat. So they sent the small 15-footer to be built, and they sent some Algonac craftsmen over to help the Dutchmen in the Holland area learn how to build boats, which they did very well. And then the Algonac supervisors would then go back and let the Hollanders run it, and they did. And the first boat built in the Holland plant was sold in Spring Lake at Bauman Marine. That was a Chris Craft dealer for them as well. So they were very happy to have such a close connection to the Chris Craft Corporation. And then soon after that, of course, larger boats were built because the Hollanders proved that they could build just about anything. So then the war, like everywhere in America, came to Holland. And what happened is that people, it was hard to build boats with government contracts if you weren't an unknown entity. And while Chris Craft was, and they did fine, some of the companies like Jessex, they had great boat builders, but they didn't have the connections to get the contract. So Victory Shipbuilding was a Chicago company that came to the Holland area and leased the Jessic boat yard to build subchasers like the 1063, which is right here. And they were built out of wood and largely in the same place that the little boats were built, very tight quarters from what Lois Jessic Hayes told me, but they were able to build at least 2 of these. And this is the 1942 launching of the first one. 1064, I believe, was the second one. Both served in action during the war. You can see they had to put them in during the ice, and they did the rigging in the winter outside the barn because it was too small. So they had to do the rigging out in the weather. Victory also built tugboats. And that was some of the things that Jessica got involved in too. And I think this photo is so funny because here's what they call a yard tug. And a lot of these went out into the naval yards along the coast of America to push and pull large ships in or out of harbors. You can see that this boat is being towed to a mooring by a rowboat with a motor on it. So they either didn't have it marinized with a motor yet, or they were simply just going to go park it out on the mooring until they maybe got an engine from a supplier. But that's the Jessic brothers pulling this tugboat around the lake. Of course, the biggest company to build boats in the Holland area during World War II was Chris Craft. And while they built 11 different models, the biggest known and, well, the biggest production number and the well-known is the landing craft that not only served at Normandy, they invaded France, but the Philippines, and some were even seen in Italy for the invasion of the southern Europe. And here you see a photograph of the 8000s landing craft. They would build these out of plywood, largely, and they had a steel door. It was really the only protection for the men when they landed on the beaches was a steel door that would then flop down. But the rest of the boat was built out of plywood, which made it easy to build quickly. I think they could build 4 a day in Holland with 1 shift, 8 a day with 2 shifts, meaning morning and day and afternoon, I should say. They would then put them on these tractor trailers or by train. They would do both, and they would take them all the way to Algonac, where they were then put back in the water and tried out on the St. Clair River. And then young Chris Smith, who some of you might have known as an older Chris Smith that passed away either earlier this year or late last year. Chris, as a teenager, that was his job, was to test the landing craft before they were brought back out of the water and then shipped to the West Coast and East Coast to be sent overseas. After the war, a lot of the companies ceased building boats. Either the war changed their mind or they found that they couldn't make it financially because they weren't able to get contracts. And, and one of those was probably Jessex. I think the Jessex, from what Lois told me, they were largely focusing again on a marina that you now know as Eldine's. They were going in that direction. They did a little bit of boat building, but largely they were selling other people's boats. Like they became the Chris Craft dealer. for the Holland area, so that was very lucrative for them. And this is a boat show display from 1949. Um, and here's a shot of them, morphing into their real calling, which was to become one of the best marinas in Michigan on the west side of Michigan and east side of Lake Michigan. And this is, you can see the brown or darker buildings was the original structure that they lived in and worked in 1913, and how it's already starting to expand out into the lake. They have moorings now. As you know now, that will get very much larger into the 70s. Campbell Boat Company did make it through the war. Kenny Campbell, who was their owner and chief naval architect, he went down the lake and worked for Jessex and for Victory Shipbuilding just to make money. And a lot of the men that worked for him before the war ended up going into service or other boat companies to try to make ends meet. After the war, Kenny, a noted naval architect from the East Coast, started building wooden boats like this for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. I think this boat is just too beautiful to be even used in military use, but they would have used them after the war, just like a lot of pleasure boat users, just different equipment. But this is a rare photo of that post-war era in the same building. I was talking to a few of the boat builders before they passed, and Kenny had his shop unheated. So those boats were built in whatever temperature was outside. It might have been a little warmer in the shed, but they were largely built so that the boat didn't contract and expand any different than would have if it had been built outside, which is a good thing for a boat to have it in its natural state if you can. The men would dodge back once in a while and go back for the furnace, which was, they had a large furnace that was used to create steam to bend boards to build boats. And the men would go back there and warm up, and then they'd have to come back out and work in this cold shed. So it was a different way of life than current boat factories. Here's a beautiful photo of the old launching area of Campbell's, which is still there. If you go to the launch ramp and look west, you can still see some of the remnants of the launching area of the backside of Campbell Boat Company. But this is how they went into the water without their rigging. And then the men would bring it around to the dock, and then they would install the mast and boom and other rigging outside of the shed. Again, Chris Craft continued to do very well after the war. Here's a picture of one of their managers, Harry Call and his wife in 1951 on their boat Call Again. It's a nice play on words. Harry was there probably the longest and served during the best years at Chris Craft in Holland. A few of the gentlemen that came back from the war that had desires to be boat builders but no experience founded what they known to be Ensign Boats, and it's one of two, believe it or not, companies in Grasscup. So I went a little bit out of the Holland area, went into Grasscup. They don't say Grasscup on the brochure, but that's where they built them. And they built these little Carvel plank, which if you can think of like a traditional Chris Craft, they have beautiful mahogany boards that are bent around the hull. That's Carvel planking. It's smooth and beautiful. They did the same thing in the Grasscup area up at the Ensign Boats. And some of you might have remembered Lloyd Van Rolte. He was a big part of the Ottawa school district on the north side. He worked there after coming back from the war. And in interviewing Lloyd before he passed, he would be a person I would say was struggling with PTSD. He had come out of the war. He had been at Hope. He had gone back to Hope, and it just wasn't fitting. I mean, this man had seen some bad things in the war. And I think sitting there with young students from Hope that hadn't, I think it was just a tough thing for him to understand, and maybe his place in life. So he, encouragement of the president, he left Hope and went to work for Ensign, just to try to see if he could find some peace after the war. And he ended up working in the grass cut plant for a year or two until, unfortunately, they didn't last very long. It was a small boat, probably, affordable, but unfortunately they were competing with Chris Craft, and that would have been very tough. Chris Craft just wasn't just in a Holland competitor, it was a world competitor. And small boats like Ensign would have had a terrible time competing with something so large, especially when they were building boats very similar to this. So they didn't last very long. Another person that some of you might remember was Robert Lynn. The Lynn family has been in Holland since the war. Some of you might know Lori Boss. She is the granddaughter of Robert Lynn, and they started on the Washington Avenue area. If you're heading on the Washington Avenue area and there's Village Inn Pizza on the right, you look left, there's kind of a white cement building to the left. That would have been the original Romer Boat Company. Bob had worked for Campbell Boat Company right after the war, learning how to work with steel. The Campbell guys were helping him learn how to build and weld steel boats. And he took that information and then opened up his own company called Romer Boat on Washington Avenue. And this is a rare photo of Bob in one of his first boats with that door wide open so you could see him. They were a lot more primitive than the Romer boats that would be built later on under the Chris Craft ownership, but it's still very important for you to see right here on Lake Mac. Look at that beautiful background. That's Lake Mac. And Bob would build a steel hull and then put a wood deck and roof on these boats right there. Wasn't a very big company, probably 10 guys worked for him. He started that right after the war. Bob Lynn made more money working for post-war contracts than he did ever with Romer. The pleasure boating company era really hadn't taken off huge for steel. People were a little bit, wood is wood. I don't know about the steel. And fiberglass would go through the same sort of questioning. Bob made dozens of these yard tugs, just like Victory Shipbuilding did. And almost all of them were put in the water right there at Jessex because they had the largest way to do that on the east coast of Lake Michigan. So everybody went down to Jessex to launch these boats. This is one of those going in the water. That contract with the Army for Bob kept him going during the early stages of pleasure boat building to the point where he had a really nice looking boat when he sold it to Chris Craft in '55. One of the gentlemen I love following was Victor Watkins. He was buying boats from the Mac Bay Boat Company, which was located in the old Bayview Furniture down there on the lake. And they were building furniture, but they were looking to do a little more in the basement area and make some extra money. And the White family decided, let's build some boats down there. So the what is known as the Playboy or the Mac Bay boat was built in this low ceiling basement right there next to the Heinz plant. And then they would sell them through Victor Watkins, who was kind of a broker in the area. I have the 53 version of this. I can't wait to restore it because it's going to be so Holland to have that with me. The Playboy name only lasted 1 year because they ran into a copyright issue or a trademark issue with somebody, but I've never been able to find it. And it's not what you think. It was probably car companies. A lot of them had Playboy cars back then. It was just, a phrase they used. So in the following year, because they used a gray marine engine, they started calling them Gray Boys, which is not, in my opinion, a great marketing scheme. But you can see the KW, that was Connetts and Watkins. Those are the two gentlemen that were brokering these boats. And these are the two guys in the boat. But this is what it looks like if you see one. These are still around. There's probably a dozen of them that I know about. Beautiful boats. And they're made out of molded plywood. This is the first time Holland saw boats largely coming in from the Grand Rapids area that were already pre-made. So this hull was formed using glue and hot furnace. They would form the boat and then bake it into this shape. And then they would deliver you a boat without a deck and an interior. And then Mac Bay put the interior windshields and the motors on the boats. This would also be something you'll see later on in Holland. The company was Wagemaker in the Grand Rapids area, who provided a lot of boat hulls like that to not only Holland, but around America. Here's a rare photo in the 1950s. After the Bayview Furniture era, that whole property was bought by Heinz. The family sold it and got out of the furniture business. The employees bought the name and moved it downtown on 7th Street. And there's a bar there. I can't remember what the name of it is now. But that bar on 7th Street is kind of a brick stone building. That was where Mac Bay located during the early 50s before they moved to the Muskegon area. Leon Slickers would also use that building when he started S2 Yachts. So it has a lot of history. I wish they'd promote it more. I wish there were more photographs of the boat building industry in that bar, but that's, they're the owners. Here's a photo of when they moved under the Dobbin family. Some of you might have known Cliff Dobbin. He went to Hope College, and his family had a huge Chrysler dealership in the Muskegon area. The Dobbins owned the company when they moved it to the South Airport Road location. Unfortunately, this factory, soon after I interviewed Cliff and got the records out of there, it ended up getting torn down as well. So we lost another one, but just beautiful boats made up through this. 1960 was when they went out of business in the Holland area, or the Muskegon area. The fiberglass boat era had started and they weren't able to keep up. They were still building wooden boats and it just didn't work out. After the war, the Jessicks, largely because one of the brothers, Bill, fell in love. When he got back from the war, he was the only Jessick brother to go to war. The others stayed in the boatyard to help build boats for Victory Shipbuilding or worked on commercial fishing in the area, which is also a war necessity industry. Bill came back and he really got into sailing. Before that, it was largely just his sister, Lois. So Bill got into the International 110 boat sailing after the war and convinced his father to, hey, we should build those again. And they did. And so in the 50s was a second generation of Jessick built International 110s. And here's a really cool photo of one coming out of the boat shed and getting ready for probably shipment or a rigging put on it. But again, they decided that building even the International 110 was really cost efficient. So they ended up going full into the marina business. And this is a photo taken in 1970 of the growth that they experienced after the war as they moved towards more of a marina type and storage business. Took up most of that end of the lake, as you can see. And that's now Eldine's now. And this was 1973. They sold out to Eldine's, and the Jessick name kind of left the area as a business, but certainly not for the people, the brothers and sisters that were still in the area. This Chris Craft company, again, did very well during the war, did very well after the war. And in fact, you can see the expansion in 1956. There's a small area. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but that's the original building. And then this is the expansion that took place in 1952. And it's probably 2/3 the size it was originally. During that time, there were sometimes 600 people would work at Chris Craft in 2 different shifts. And during the fiberglass era, that was especially true. There were boom and busts, even for Chris Craft. There's slow periods in any industry, and the summer is a terrible time for the boating industry. If you're building boats, it's when they're all being sold. Chris Craft devised a plan though, where they were selling boats year round, and they were storing them not only with their brokers, but with their own facilities. So they always had a constant flow of boats going out and a constant load of work for their employees. So they had a consistent job for a lot of people in the Holland area. And this is much like this today when you drive by. 1955, Romer, Bob Lynn's Romer, decided that the money being offered from the conglomerate Chris Craft was too good, and he sold out. And they had not built steel boats yet in the Chris Craft history, but it was something they wanted to get into. Steel boats were becoming very popular, especially in the cruisers. Good, stable, solid boats, and they wanted to have that in their portfolio. So they bought out the local Bob Lynn. And a year later, they started moving towards a factory. And by 1962, with the help of young Chris Smith, he was a young naval architect at that time, he helped design the Romer plant, which is squeezed between Howard Avenue, or not Howard, Douglas and Lakewood. It's still a huge building. You can see it there even today. But this was the first purpose-built factory of this size in the world to build steel boats, and Chris Smith was largely part of that process. And then after the war, we also saw Kenny Campbell in 1956. He had been suffering from Parkinson's disease when he left Bethlehem Steel to come to Holland. It was more of a targeted way of spending his last years doing really wanted to do, and that was building pleasure boats, and to be able to kind of retire into his disease, which was is some of the employees I interviewed said, in the end it was quite bad. Kenny was suffering, and the employees did a lot of the work just to try to keep the company going. But in the end, after Kenny died, his wife, Mrs. Campbell, left the facility and rented it to the Beacon Boat Company from Milwaukee under the Monkwitz family, came in and leased it. And they picked up a couple contracts that Kenny Campbell had with the Navy, including this very large 40-foot Navy utility boat that was built right after the Korean War. One of my favorite builders, because I knew Jason Petrulia so well, was Skipper Craft. My first boat ever purchased in the Holland area was a Skipper Craft. I didn't buy it from I bought it from Dale Moose, but I went out there and took a tour of it, of the boat facility where it was being stored with Jason, which was quite a thrill for a young historian. And this is one of his better known models. It's the Sportsman brand at the 1956 Grand Rapids Boat Show. And I had asked him, I said, 1956, so was that Mrs. Petrulia? And he said, no, there was a young model who wanted to get some photographs for her portfolio, and she agreed to sit in the boat most of the day and be my model for my boat. So we're not sure who it is. He didn't remember who it was, but this is a very typical shot of what a Skipper Craft from 1952 to 1960 would have looked like, and built by Jason Petrulia, who we also lost. Jason had worked for a short time with Leon Slickers, who founded S2 Yachts. They both worked at the Chris Craft plant, and during a strike, they decided they should team up and build boats together. And they built a few, I guess you'd call them Slicker Petrulia boats, much like this. And after the strike, Jason decided in 1952 that he was tired of the labor union problems that they were having at the Chris Craft plant, that he wanted to go out on his own. And he founded Skipper Craft boats in 1952. Leon went back for a few years and worked at the plant till 54, until he had enough money to start what became Slick Craft boats. And that's when Jason, it's an interesting combination of the desires of both men to do things maybe at a different time in life, later or earlier. And religiously, because Jason was Christian Reformed. He didn't work on Sundays or sell boats. And then Leon, Seventh-day Adventist, doesn't do that on Saturdays. So that there was a small conflict there too, when they would work in Leon Slicker's garage Sunday or Saturday, but also when they would sell boats. And they both were pretty adamant about that. And that was part of the reason of the break, was religious differences, but also just desires to be entrepreneurs sooner than later. So different things happened in this industry, and some of it is just, personal. Leah or Jason also designed the plug, or the male, if you want to call it, model that a fiberglass boat mold is built on. And he built that for Clyde Paul. And Clyde Paul, you might remember the Paul Museum on the north side of town. That was Clyde's dad's museum. Clyde worked heavily with his father in the toy manufacturing era in the 50s, but they also delved into building fiberglass boats. And the first ones built in Holland were built by Clyde Paul, right on 6th Street, which is now part of the power plant industrial area, park, I guess you call it. This is a rare 1957 model that a friend of mine restored, and now is part of those electric boats that you can rent in Saugatuck. This is in their livery that you can go down and rent this. And they've been converted to electric, same outboard, but they put electric motors in them. So you can enjoy these pleasure craft, but in a safe, controlled manner. So this is this is like the model I'm working on now, but mine has a wood top. And unfortunately, Clyde passed away a couple years ago. He had a good run from the early 1950s to 1960. One of the reasons Clyde quoted was that his wife didn't like him coming home every day after working in the boat company and smelling like styrene. Styrene is that awful smell that's created when you build fiberglass boats. If you ever take a tour of the S2 plant, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. And it gets into your body after a day or years, and you off gas it, you smell. So not only do you breathe it out of your lungs, but it comes out of your skin. And that was one of the reasons Clyde decided not to build boats anymore. And he just really got tired of working with the sticky fiberglass resin, but he did beautiful work. Like I was saying, after the war, or after the strike in 1952, Leon Slickers went back to work for Chris Kraft and he was a foreman in one of the departments. And in 1955, he decided that he would sell his house. And I think he said with $3,000, him and Dolores Slickers started the Slickcraft Boat Company in 1956. And if you go down Washington Avenue, on the left, right there at 32nd Street by the car wash, is Home Heating. That is the original Slickcraft Boat Company, Home Heating. And that's where Leon, Dolores, and the three boys, Tom, Robert, and I can't think of the third one. They lived in that upstairs area, and they built boats below. And then they added a little on the back when their daughter was born, but that was where the family lived for many years before moving out outside of town to build a new, beautiful new house by the factory. Leon started this in 1956 officially. He had been selling boats out of his garage before that. So I've never found one of those, but they're out there. This would have been the one you see here is one of the first boat brochures. And like any young boat builder, you use your wife as your model in your boat, and that's Dolores waving at you there. Again, Leon and Dolores in the 1959 brochure cover, saving money. This is when they started to paint their boats, these beautiful late 50s colors. This is a wood boat. It's the red. It looks like red, but it's mahogany. It's kind of a misleading print, but they did have colored boats. Most of the time, Leon was still making mahogany colored boats. I was able to restore one like this, and it was so much fun. It was so nice to be able to do one of these. Back to the Chris Craft Company, because it doesn't ever seem to go away. You see an interior photo of them as they're building the larger photos in the late 50s. They had gotten away from the small boats. Cadillac company, they built another plant in the Cadillac area during World War II to help with the landing craft building. And the smaller boats went to the smaller factory in Cadillac. Well, Holland became the largest boat building company under one roof in the world. They had them working on the larger cruisers. And you can see the workmen, rare photos of men and women working on boats. Chris Craft was very good about documenting their boat building process. And thankfully, this photograph album was left behind in the factory building when Mr. McLeod bought it and given to the Holland Museum. So it's just a treasure. They finally, Chris Craft finally got into using fiberglass very reluctantly. 1957, they built a small boat called the Lake and Sea, which I can tell you about later. They had a terrible time. It became known as the leak and sink. It's a horrible moniker for a boat company to have leak and sink. So they got out of fiberglass building 8 months after they got into it. And it didn't really mess around with fiberglass other than parts until 1964, when they built what's known as the 38-foot Commander. And Chris Smith, again, was involved in the building of this very first Chris Craft fiberglass boat. And this is the one, I was at a conference in St. Michael's, Maryland a year ago. And I said, if you're looking for an early Chris Craft cruiser, this is the one, because they built them so well and so heavily that they're never gonna deteriorate. And one of the women in the crowd owned one and took me on a tour of hers. So it was quite nice to see one, to get on it and enjoy it. But this was when Chris Craft finally made the step into fiberglass, and they quickly got out of wood boat building after this, because this is what the consumer wanted. And Chris Craft knew how to build one very well. They also continued to sell the steel roamers until they got into the 1960s, and people were really looking at the aluminum boat industry strongly, and not only just small aluminum boats, but bigger aluminum boats. And that's when the roamer plant converted over to building aluminum. It's just a lighter boat. It's easier to work with, and in some ways it's more durable in different conditions. But you can see the differences already in just the design that Chris Craft brought to the Bob Lynn original. They really added a lot of style and flair and colors to the original roamer boats. Leon Slickers was also growing. He moved down Washington Avenue to what was an old skating rink. It's right close by where the Family Fair is now on Washington Avenue. And he converted that old roller rink into a modern boat company and really started building boats. Here's a shot from the 1960s. You can see the production line is much like an automobile. And, you know, Leon took that hint from Chris Craft, just like everybody else, to build boats in a production style like that. One of the gentlemen that in the boating industry, especially in Michigan, kept popping up was George Glenn Eddy. He had been part of the Century Boat Company in the 30s when they almost went out of business, and several other companies of his own on the east side, Port Huron, Bay City area. His final boat company, ironically enough, was in Holland, and it was a Holland Power Boats Inc. And they built wooden boats. And unfortunately, Jason Petrulia had left. He had closed Skipper Craft in 1959 and had worked with this gentleman out there where the original Power Quest building used to be, and the steel company now. And just this George Glenn Eddy was such a terrible businessman, great ideas, great designs, terrible businessman. And Jason went to go to work one day and the door was locked with a bank notice. And this gentleman had lost yet another bank or another boat company to the bank. And Jason had lost his tools. And it was just a horrible feeling for a boat builder to end that way. And George Glenn Eddy worked for a few years as a naval architect with Herb Pollock, who just passed away. And Herb and him had worked on Vietnam era swift boats off the coast of Vietnam, where they could go up and down the rivers and fight. And then George Glenetti was living in the Holland area when he died of lung cancer. He was quite a smoker, Herb told me. And in the end, George Glenetti owed Herb money. He passed away. I mean, the guy just is a terrible businessman. It's unfortunate. Such a great mind, but terrible businessman. This is a rare photo that the Eddy family are still running around the Michigan area. Their grandson shared this with me, and he had the same feeling about his grandfather, just terrible with money. One of my favorite companies, unfortunately short-lived, was the Michigan Fiberglass Company. They were on Howard Avenue. They were right across the street from the Chris Craft plant, and it had been one of the old, I think it had been an aniline dye had been in there, maybe another large company from can't think of, there was one of the Holland Furnace had owned that building at one time too. They built just a small run of fiberglass boats called Wondercraft, and they were Lake and Sea. And this is a company that I really love. I got so attached to these guys that when I found the molds at a field in Traverse City 3 years ago. I grabbed all the molds to build these boats. They had been languishing out there since the 60s. Now I got them. So if you ever need a Lake and Sea, let me know. I probably can get you something. But this was just a year-long business in the Holland area. They were building boats for a Traverse City-based company, Parsons, who would own the Lake and Sea name. And they just built just a one-year run of boats. Unfortunately, the downfall for the Michigan Fiberglass Company was just the construction techniques were not good. A lot of the boats weren't usable when they got done. There were imperfections and issues with production. So unfortunately, it didn't last very long. In the end, they left and went to Borculo. If you go into downtown Borculo, as you know, there's a cross street there with a light. There was a factory on the right. There's a gas station now. That's where the Michigan Fiberglass Company died officially in 1963. As all of this is going on, of course, Leon Slickers is growing in both reputation and financially. And in 1969, he had been offered money from Brunswick Corporation, which is the conglomerates are starting to buy up the small companies now. And I'm sorry, not Brunswick, AMF. And Leon, he said the money was just too good. I couldn't turn it down anymore. So he sold off to AMF in 1969, and he lasted until 74. When he sold the company, and this is not uncommon, you would find yourself into a non-compete clause so that you couldn't continue to build a competitor boat that you just sold. So Leon signed a non-compete clause for 5 years and worked for AMF in the Holland plant running that division. AMF is a conglomerate, and they wanted the same people to continue to build the fine boats, and Leon did. And you can see in the front row there's Leon, and then a couple, I think one of the boys are in the back here. David and Bob are in the back. And here is, this would be Bob Vandevusse's dad. He was at Chris Craft for many years. He was hired away from Chris Craft by Leon. I can't think of Mr. Vandevusse's first name, but that's a few of the faces I recognize. At AMF, things were done pretty well under Leon's guidance, but when he left in 74, the boats were still slick grass, but probably not given the care that Leon and his family would have saw when they built the boats. And they went out of business in 1980. The company was shut down even after Leon had left. So in 1974, Leon took the money that he had made in the 69 sale and took it over And because he was kind of within that 5-year window yet of non-compete, he decided that he would build sailboats, which wasn't in the non-compete clause. So he built sailboats from a Chicago designer in that 7th Street building, which is a bar now. And he built boats, and they would take it out into the street and pop the boat out of the mold in the middle of the street at night, and then push the boat back in and finish it. And here's Leon in 1974 looking happy as a sailor. And he'll even admit today, Leon is still with us, that he's not a huge sailboat sailor, but the brochure photo. So they built these for several years, and they became very competitive boats in the racing series, and especially in the Chicago area, and very collectible, these sailboats to this day. The other grass cup company that I told you there were two was the Love family. Randy and Yvonne Love opened up what they called the Lovecraft Boat Company in Grasscup to build these little pedal powered pontoon boats, if you want to call them. And they also had a version that had a motor on it. So you had a motorized pontoon boat. And their biggest contract was with Disney in Florida. 50 of these boats were shipped to Florida to be used in the lagoons in the Disney area for their guests. Unfortunately, that only lasted a few years, and then they went ahead and decided to put there was issues with them, some employee issues, and sales were falling short, so they decided not to continue on. And unfortunately, that business venture ended in divorce, and which is very common in this boating industry that I study. A lot of debt, divorce, suicide. Sometimes it's a very tough industry to be successful in. Another boat company that you might remember, Ed Voss, his son, who used to run Reliable Sports. He was so in love with this pontoon houseboat company in Florida that he bought it in 1979 and brought it to Holland to try to save it. But unfortunately, again, just couldn't get the right equipment, couldn't get the right employees, and sales were soft. So Ed decided to sell or just end the company in the 1980s. He used to sell these over where the post office is now. You might remember these being out in the parking lot. And Ed also sold them over by Reliable Sports. Here's a shot of Leon's, some of his sailboats being built. This is how you put a sailboat together. It's like a power boat. You build the deck and put it all together, and then you lower it over the hull. And then you put it together with adhesive and fasteners, and you have a 2-part boat. Some of the boat companies that came out in the 80s had gone back to old technology. Grand Craft, you might have been, the Nordheis family started the Grand Craft company there in an old furniture. Oh no, it was a lumber company. And Dick Sly ended up owning it for the longest period. You might remember Dick building the Grand Craft boats. He took traditional mahogany plank boat building and introduced fiberglass construction techniques, the resin. So he would take the boards, put the boat together, and impregnate it with the resin, which is like a very tough plastic. And that allowed Dick to build a very waterproof boat, and then he was able to put varnish on it and still get that beautiful look. And it raised all sorts of thoughts in the traditional boat building industry about introducing fiberglass techniques to wood boat building. But Dick proved him wrong, and these boats are still going strong. This boat company last year, 2022, you might remember can't think of the gentleman out on on the north side of town. He owned it. He bought it from the bank. There was a couple owners between Dick and him that lost it to the bank. It was just not well run. It was purchased from them in 22, and it's now in the Wisconsin area, Wentworth County. And not only are they building beautiful Grand Crafts, but they're introducing brand new models to the line, which are doing very well. I think look up Grandcraft on the internet, and I think you'll be very impressed at what that Holland legacy has gone to Wisconsin. A couple of the other boat companies in the 80s was Power Play, which became Power Quest later on. Here, Todd Camps and Kevin Hurtis with their fathers pulling their very first Power Play boat out of the mold as young men. One was an insurance agent, that was Kevin, and then Todd was working a little bit with boats, and they decided they wanted to be boat builders, and bought a mold out of Grand Haven and decided to start building their own boats. And after many lean years, they were very successful when they sold Power Quest. So they did very well. They ended up out there in the off Chicago Drive where the car dealers are. They were a block north of that. That's where the old company was. It's now a steel company. Another business was Westies. 1988, they decided to start building boats. And it's the same factory that they used to do Power Play. There's a mold coming out of that building, and this is how you turn it. They had built it upside down, and now they're going to turn it over and finish the job. Westies today is known as New Holland Marine Group. You might know them under that name. A company, you might remember the Bowens family. They're still in the Holland area. In 87, 89, they built the Bowens boats. They had been financially supporting a local gentleman who was building what they called bandit boats. And the building that he was building those in, they owned it. And he ran out of money and things got a little tight. So the Bowens family bought him out and allowed him to continue building their boats. Again, great boat builder, not a good businessman. And so the Bowens family, as you know, is more of developers. They also owned a boat company in the late 80s. Very collectible. I've only seen one of these in Holland, and they're beautiful go-fast boats from the 80s. I was talking to one of the Bowens, it might have been, I can't remember which Bowens I interviewed. He said that we purchased this company largely because there were a lot of teenagers in the Bowens family, and everybody thought this would be a great idea, except the father. But the boys had a great time with these boats for a few years. One of the last composite boat builders in the Holland area that, other than Tierra that are left, and North Holland Boat Company was, it was a short-lived, they're not boat builders by trade, but composite builders of Holland. They're over on 18th Street in the industrial area. They were part of the 2019 America's Cup boat building frenzy, and they were working with the syndicate. That's what they call the people that have the money. It was a Stars and Stripes USA team. They contracted with Brian McInnes and his family to build one of these monohull with hydrofoil racing boats for the America's Cup. They were working on it very well in 2019, and by 2020, the money had run out of the syndicate, and the syndicate stopped production of the boat. So I'm not sure where the boat ended up going, but Brian was involved in that early on. Today, composite builders of Holland work not only building marine type things, they go under the water, they do aerospace, they also build bikes for the Paralympics and things like that. So they're very involved in a variety of fiberglass products for all sorts of communities. I wish they had gotten the boat finished. I would have loved to see them in the Challenger series. This is a 75-foot boat that goes 45 miles an hour with sail power on hydrofoils. It's when the Brits were racing in, I believe they were in Auckland when they raced, one of these crashed, if you think. They came off the hydrofoil and somebody was killed on the boat. I mean, it's a very fast way to sail a boat, and not a lot of protection for the crew. So very interesting designs. which leads us to today. And, I was sad when Grandcraft left Holland last year. I'm glad that the family took it to Wisconsin to continue its legacy and to build really beautiful boats. But Holland right now is from 52 boat companies, and its history is now down to two. We have Tiara, which is S2 Yachts. In 2018, S2 Yachts, which is the parent company of Tiara and Pursuit Fishing Boats, was sold. First company sold out of the family to Malibu Boats, and they're doing very well in Fort Pierce, Florida. Leanne Slickers had started that company 41 years before with young Tom Slickers, who is now the president of S2 Yachts. So it was estimated that the sale was well over $100 million to sell the Pursuit boat line out of the family. So I think it probably, industry analysts would probably say it was probably necessary for them to do that so they can concentrate on bigger S2 yachts. And now they're building 63-foot fiberglass boats. So I think the money went to a good cause and probably expanding their big line. And if you watch Pursuit or you watch S2 Yachts brochures closely, you'll notice that they're building a very similar boat to the Pursuit fishing boat. Is now being built under the S2 name as a kind of those center console sports fishing boats. So they sold Pursuit, but they still like to make fishing boats. So keep an eye on that. And then of course, New Holland Marine Group, they're still building that 1939 design International 110 out of fiberglass. So you can still sail the International 110s, but now they're made out of fiberglass right here in Holland. So, or right there, sorry. You're in Holland, I'm not. So they're still building those for people to use. So, and then lastly, all of that work in 2018, my wife Jennifer and I worked on a book called Boats Made in Holland, sold through the History Press. I always wanted always to do a book on that subject, and I think at that point in my life I was close to retirement. And Jen is a great editor, so we spent a year working on this boat, and I thought it came out quite nice. It included everything I could get into it, and the editor or the publisher insisted I cut out a few small companies for space. So I created a website called Boats Made in Holland that you can look at that include those smaller boat companies that I didn't include today and couldn't be included in the book, unfortunately. But that's the way of the publishing world. So is there any questions? I know that was a rapid run through history there.
Thank you, Geoff. We appreciate that and for guiding through all of your various companies that you mentioned there. I do have a couple of questions from some of the audience that have shared those. And I have a personal question for you. One, as a grandson of someone who managed a marina in Bay City, Michigan, and whose father detailed old wooden Chris crafts as his first job at 13, 14, and 15. I just wanted to ask you, what is your personal experience in, I know you mentioned you have a YouTube channel detailing or redoing an old Chris craft, is that correct?
I have a YouTube channel that details me working on a Wondercraft.
Wondercraft, okay.
Yeah, I owned a Chris craft for a year, and somebody wanted it so bad I couldn't turn down the money, so I sold it. I sold it to Dick Sly, who had a client that needed it. So I found out early with even that slick craft, which was a very small one, it was going to be $15,000 just to put it back together. And I, at that point in my life, didn't have that kind of money and skill set, so it was an easy sell. I'm very focused on Holland built boats and Lake and Sea Boats, which is a Traverse City company. So the YouTube channel, largely because I own 15 boats and only 2 of them are seaworthy, I have a retirement full of boat restoration ahead of me. But I think you have to find a focus, and I did the Holland boats early on when I lived in Holland, and I'm finishing up my Wondercraft. I wanted to get it done to show Clyde Paul before he passed away, but I just didn't have the time to get it done. So the YouTube channel that I have now called Reynolds Runabouts on YouTube it's heavily, I mean, there's 12 chapters on the restoration of this wondercraft, which I started in 2020 or I started 2001. And I've had some hiccups, between here and there on time and money. So I finally in retirement was able to build the shop of my dreams and put together some funds to work on this boat and get it done and in the water for the summer. I want to get it on the water for boat shows too. But
Great.
I got other ones after that. Keep me busy.
List of projects for sir.
Yep.
A question from one of our guests here today is, with all the companies that you outlined in your presentation, how did the Holland area find enough skilled woodcrafts people to do some of this early work?
Well, in the industry, like wood boat building, furniture wood makers are perfect source. So unfortunately, at that time, even in the furniture industry, you had highs and lows in the production year. So they would hire away woodworkers from the furniture companies in Holland and Grand Rapids because they were out of work or they weren't working enough. And then a lot of them just stayed. A lot of those gentlemen brought their kids into the factory and they worked as young people and stayed. I mean, it was a great blue collar job in the Holland area to work for Chris Craft. And then we're a lot of farmers too. This is very common in the boat building industry. When you have farmers not working in the winter and boat builders needing more workers in the winter to ramp up for spring, summer sales, they will bring farmers in with certain skills to work on boats. So that was a big part of Elginak's success in the Holland area too.
At this time, I want to ask anyone if they have any questions. I have one more here from a guest, but if anyone would like to unmute themselves and ask a question of Geoff, please go ahead and do so. While we'll wait for those, Geoff, the question is, you shared a lot of marketing materials in which a lot of these boat builders use their own spouses as models. Was there a marketing company in the Holland area that helped build some of these marketing campaigns, or were these usually independently done by the companies themselves?
It's interesting. Most of them used in-house marketing personnel, and then they would use local print sources, like printing companies like Steckity Van Heist would do the printing. But largely, they were doing a lot of the work at their houses on their coffee tables. Remember Leanne's Liquor saying he was, they would work on the coffee table. Like, what do you want to put in the brochure this year? And they'd find some photos that somebody maybe had shot of her or him and Dolores on the water. Yeah, it's very interesting how that all kind of emerged. Now, Leanne, even though Leanne is officially retired now at S2 Yacht, they use helicopters in Miami now. They're off the beautiful coast of Miami and the helicopters are flying around. I mean, things have gone. Here's a very small company that has done unbelievable things in the Holland area. And that, you see that big, beautiful plant on 40th Street. And gosh, it just makes you, wow, he's done well. Leanne has done well. Yeah.
So if you think of some of the more modern Holland area boat builders that are more on the luxury side, were these boats accessible to the average person back in the 40s and 50s when this kind of hit commercial level?
I would say Leanne's boats were affordable until S2 Yachts probably changed a lot of that. I think his value of his boats rose quite significantly when the Tierra line was involved. And I think, you think of why do they call it Tierra Yachts? Well, Leanne is very point blank when he talks about quality, and the royalty of the Tiara was why he chose that name. All of his boats, if you ever look at the boats that are in the brochures, they all say Crown Jewel or something. It has to do with a royalty factor on all of his boats. And that's because he wanted that feeling of upper level quality and, style. And he's just really, he's got a great mind as an entrepreneur. Left Holland, he left school at 16. And lived in the Diamond Springs area, left, school at 16, couldn't get into the Chris Craft factory until he was 18. I mean, the guy has always wanted to be a boat builder, he said. I think the boys would say the same thing. Tom and Robert and David they all grew up in the factory and hated school because they wanted to be in the boat company. It's just such a great family story there. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Geoff. We appreciate your time. We have hit 11 o'clock.
Yep.
So I will say at this time, if anyone has any other questions for Geoff, you can email those to hasp@hope.edu, and we'll be happy to relay them to him with your contact information for a response. But Geoff, thank you very much on behalf of Bob, the course coordinator, and behalf of Richard Frost and the rest of the Social Sciences Committee. Thank you for your time. And thank you all for joining us today on the virtual classroom. Hope you enjoy the rest of your sunny Tuesday.
Thank you, everyone.
Take care, Geoff. Thank you.